So I got fascinated with this guy, I call him Dr. Roger because I can't pronounce his last name, on Medcram. So he has like 1.6 million subscribers on Medcram, and all the episodes are so solid, but I didn't know that much about him, and I wanted to meet him, and here was my chance. I also thought about inviting him to be a TEDx speaker, and this was my chance to get to know him better and see how solid he really was. But the highlight of this was his knowledge about infrared light and how it improves your overall health and your skin. You're going to enjoy this episode. So the bonus of this episode is one of your favorite people, my best girl, will do half the interview. We've been married for 50 years. So you're an emergency room doc.
No, actually, critical care.
Critical care, what's the difference?
So critical care is the doc upstairs in the ICU who's taking care of those ICU patients. He gets called by the ER doc.
Right, so that's where I've gone after a few 6-hour sessions in the emergency room, then I'm in the ICU for 3 days.
Yeah, you don't want to see us if it's possible. It's possible, but yes, you will. If you're admitted to the hospital, because the ER doc has considered that you've got a critical disease, then you'll see me. That's half the time. The other half the time, I'm in the clinic seeing people with lung ailments or sleep ailments.
And that's because you're a lung doctor?
Yes.
It's pulmonary?
Pulmonary, yeah.
Yeah, but you're quadruple board certified.
Yeah. So
what is that all about?
So the way it works, it's almost a prerequisite. You can't do it any other way. To be a lung doctor, you have to have gone through internal medicine training for 3 years. And then you do another, for me, it was 3 years of training. And that 3 years automatically included pulmonary and critical together.
Yeah, wow.
So then the added extra was the sleep medicine.
You know, emergency room docs, I told you yesterday, are just my heroes because they brought me back from the dead. We can't count how many times, but at least 3, probably 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many lives I'm on, but anyway, I bow down to you guys. It's just amazing. So, I mean, I know you're not emergency room, you're
I understand.
Critical care, but I've been in critical care many times.
Sometimes they call us down to help out if it's a real critical issue. But
Oh, interesting. So, and you, did you get called down during the COVID crisis?
Oh yeah, that was...
you were in the emergency room for the COVID crisis?
Not necessarily in the emergency room, but what we had to do was, since there were so many people being admitted to the hospital, we had to create a whole nother unit for COVID. And we decided early on that we wanted to have, quote unquote, a dirty COVID unit and then a non-COVID unit because we didn't want to spread disease between people. So we created a COVID unit that was completely insular and that you had to sort of go in scrubbed in, and once you were in there, it was all COVID.
Yeah, wow. And you're about to have a big birthday.
Yeah, next week.
50. The big 50.
Yeah.
Well, I had the big 70 not that long ago. So
you're looking good for 70.
You're just a child of me.
Thank you.
You're looking great.
I used to have people tell me all the time, "You're too young to be a doctor."
Yeah.
I get it once or twice, and when I do, I tell them, "You're an angel from heaven. Thank you so much for saying
Although you're
that."
getting a little gray on your beard now. So,
I am a little bit, yes.
So maybe that'll cure that. Our son-in-law is a family physician, plant-based family physician.
Excellent.
He gets that all the time. He's baby-faced, and he gets that all the time. He's in his 40s. You're too young to be a physician.
Hopefully he continues to get that, yeah.
I hope so. So quadruple board certified. So how many, because you're a sleep specialist also, you're board certified in sleep medicine?
Yes.
Well, how does that tie into the others?
Well, the reason why it ties in is because the majority of people with sleep disorders have sleep apnea. And because that's an airway issue,
I see.
They feel that that is one way of somebody with that type of a background would be good in dealing with obstructive sleep apnea.
I see.
But there are other ways of getting into obstructive sleep apnea, or even sleep medicine. So neurologists can be boarded in sleep medicine, psychiatrists can be boarded in sleep medicine, and just regular internal medicine, or even family medicine.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So Medcram is just fascinating to me. So 1.6 million subscribers on your consumer-facing YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And then you have a whole paid section.
Yes, on the website, medcram.com.
Yeah, medcram.com.
Yeah.
So the mission of Medcram was to get people through their boards?
To get students to understand what's going on. Here was the mother of necessity, in other words, is I was a professor at the medical school, and we had PA students that were rotating through. And what had happened was there's this desire, this need on a national level to have more providers. So the way to do that is just to create more schools and to have more students. What wasn't really in the equation as far as I was concerned, and a lot of the students, was getting good quality teachers. So a lot of times students were subjected to basically lectures where there was somebody up there that was told to be up there going through a PowerPoint presentation that someone else had made with a bunch of letters on it, and they weren't explaining it. So when they would come through, we would explain things clearly. We would go through things, and things made sense to people that had never seen it. So one of my students, his name is Kyle Allred, he's the other half of Medcram, saw a need, was in education before because his father was involved, and he came up with the idea of making a YouTube channel where we would take subjects that were difficult to understand for students and explain it clearly so that they could get an understanding of that. For me, it made sense because when students would come through my program, every month it was a different student. This is a way that I could say the lecture once, refer to them, have them watch it on YouTube, and then use our time together to more fully go through the details of that. It's called flipping the classroom. So that's how it started. It started back in 2012, and we started making videos on very difficult topics, explained clearly. And that started to grow. And by the time we hit 2020, which is when COVID hit, we had about 400,000 subscribers and various different things.
Blew up.
And then it just blew up because one day I did a video on COVID. And because it had a presence already on YouTube, and there was a video that was really in demand, that's what happened. Yeah, amazing. And you had an inspiration, a math class. You explain things the same way. What's it, the Khan Academy? Yes. So Khan Academy was a very similar technique of basically people learning at the speed of understanding. And so one of the things that we do is we make sure that we're drawing out the process of what we're doing in a way so that we're not losing the person who is watching it. One of the things that can sometimes happen with PowerPoint presentations is you're throwing a bunch of letters and words up there at the same time, and it's very difficult to focus on what it is that we're talking about. I see. So it's a chalk talk type of. So you're drawing. What are you drawing on? You have some kind of. It's so specifically, I have something called a Huion tablet, and it's basically it's a screen duplicator, and you have a pen, and it's touch screen. You can draw on it and do all that sort of stuff. Amazing. So now, how do you decide what's going to be for the deeper subjects where you charge, like the hyponatremia one I signed up for that blew my mind? Or the consumer-facing ones just on YouTube where there's no paywall? So what we have done is we have an agreement with a continuing medical education company called Continuing Education Company. And what we do is we make our videos, and we have an agreement that they will also market that, but then they're the ones that are able to give continuing education credits. I see. Continuing education credits for physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, respiratory therapists, all of that. And that's something that they need to do to keep up on topics. So when they are giving us to that, those particular courses would be on the paid section because that costs money to upkeep. In terms of what goes out to the YouTube channel, what is free, things of that, these are areas where I believe society, the population needs to know this right now because of things that are happening and people want to know. So for instance, none of our COVID videos were behind a paywall. Anything that we talked about COVID was just, it was there, it was freely. We did host it on the website, but it was free on the website. In fact, we even had a ventilation video on how to learn how to ventilate patients that we did for students. When COVID came up and we started to notice that because there were so many people that were sick and they were having physicians that were not trained necessarily in ventilation, how could they learn how to do that because they needed to know? We actually moved that from a pay behind the paywall and we made it free so that they could learn. So if there's something that people need to know right now because of something that's going on, and that's typically free. You know, one of the things that blows my mind, you commonly hear doctors don't know what they're talking about. And then you take one of your paid classes and it's like, oh my gosh, doctors know all this stuff? I didn't know any of this. And for me, hyponatremia was one of those things. I had it, and I do Ironman competitions and ultra runs in the heat, and I didn't keep up with my electrolytes, and I had a collapse and just about died. But then I've been pretty watch my electrolytes pretty carefully since then. A wake-up call. So I took the course because I thought, well, this is something I know something about. I can ask
Roger about this.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's like so complicated. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. The human body is the most complex machine, I think, that in the universe.
It's amazing.
If there's something more complicated, we haven't discovered it as yet. The thing that makes medicine...
Can I just interrupt you for a minute?
Sure.
There's a cardiologist at UCLA
Yeah.
who got called upon by the zoo to help with a lion who was having cardiac problems. And so she went and consulted, and she said, these veterans, I mean, they have to deal with all these different species.
Yes.
We just have one species.
Yes.
Or veterinarians, I should have said.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's so complicated. And then there are these iconic photos. I'll try to add them if I can find them to this interview, where they show the lion having open heart surgery on an operating table with her there attending the other veterinarians.
Yes.
And his big paws are sticking out from under the sheet. And it's like, wow.
And in this picture, I'm listening to the heart of a lion after a life-saving collaborative procedure with veterinarians and physicians, where we drained 700 cc's of fluid from the sac in which this lion's heart was contained. And this procedure, which I have done on many human patients, was identical, with the exception of that paw and that tail.
They have to deal with birds, reptiles, and everything else. So when you think about how complicated the human body is and how you guys get to specialize, how do you become a veterinarian? I know this is off topic, but it's got to be crazy.
I have a cousin who's a veterinarian, and actually a friend, the daughter of the friend who works at the continuing education company is also a veterinarian, and even they have to specialize. Like the ones that do the dogs and the cats, and the ones that do the exotic animals. Because you're right, it's an extremely broad area, and the different species they have to understand. But yeah, no, it's absolutely, it's very complicated. Not to say that humans alone are complicated. A lot of the same things that we see with hyponatremia in humans, it's exactly the same situation.
Oh, really? They drink too much water?
They can, but human beings are saddled, unfortunately, with a very unique set of diseases, most of which are brought on by our own selves.
Yeah. Well, the advice you get in running a marathon, and then in Ironman competitions, the marathon's in the afternoon and it's in the heat, sometimes over 100 degrees, and you're running in over 100 degrees. And like some of the marathons I entered in Africa, the marathons are much longer. Like the Comrades Marathon is 56 miles.
Oh, wow.
And it was 80-something degrees. And it's really hard to, so that, in fact, the year I did it, 2 runners died, and they were experienced runners. One right in front of me, he was a 14-year finisher, and he died, and both of them afterwards was from hyponatremia.
Yeah.
So just drank too much water, I guess, and not enough electrolytes.
That's possible, although in that situation, if it's acute, it's exactly that, is that the too much water and not enough electrolytes causes the sodium to drop. And when the sodium drops, it causes water to go into the brain cells, and the brain swells. And that's what happens.
How do you diagnose this? Because they put me in the ICU afterwards, after the 6 hours in the emergency room. They were afraid I had cardiomyopathy.
I'm not sure exactly what they found. They might have done an echocardiogram, or they may have seen something on the electrocardiogram.
I have a very low pulse rate.
Yeah, I would imagine with the amount that you've run. It's hard to say exactly what they saw, but I would not necessarily automatically assume that you had a cardiomyopathy just because you had a low sodium.
I see.
I mean, low sodium can be caused by a cardiomyopathy, but it can be caused by a whole host of other things too, yeah.
You have a signature issue, and you just brought the house down. The talk you just gave, people said, oh my gosh, I've never heard that before. It was so compelling. One of them's my wife sitting right over there, who's going to ask you questions afterwards. It's your infrared light. And just to calibrate where I am, you're looking at a guy with fair freckled Scottish skin, a reddish beard, blue eyes, who's had 6 different skin cancer operations. I have a skin graft from Mohs surgery on my nose, basal cell, squamous cell. I never have had melanoma. I've lived my life. I mean, an Ironman competition, it's hard to keep the sunscreen on and everything.
Right.
I've lived my life outdoors with my fair skin. So I've been afraid of light. And when I came across your channel, 2 years ago, it was like red light therapy. I'm not going there. And yet I'm a physicist, so I should know the difference in the electromagnetic spectrum. UV's way over past the blues, and near infrared's way over past the reds. I should have known that.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I've been sunscreening up and wearing SPF 50 shirts and everything else. And then you come along and say, no, they're different.
Yeah.
So,
well, first of all, I'm not the first one to come along with this. I don't want to make it sound like I'm the one that discovered. What I've noticed is that the people who are on the PhD side of things, who are not in medicine, they're very cautious about saying anything medical about some of the discoveries that they have come up with. But photobiomodulation, which is the name of this type of science, which is basically the use of light in human beings, is one of the most expansive and fastest growing fields of science that we have today. It's almost growing exponentially. On the other hand, you have the physicians who have been trained in this, and they've grown up with the understanding that the sun is bad, that you need to stay out of the sun, you need to check for these types of cancers and these sorts of things. And so these are two populations of areas that haven't really interacted. What forced me to sort of veer in and almost like a Venn diagram be in that connection between those two was the need to look for alternative answers for patients that are so sick and that are coming in with
like
COVID. Exactly. And the fact that as we know, those that had higher vitamin D levels seem to do much better, but yet disappointingly, that when we would supplement them with vitamin D in the hospital, we weren't getting the types of results that we really wanted to see consistently. So what is it about this? Well, what opened my eyes was an article that was published in Melatonin Research in 2019 by...
That's a journal, Melatonin Research?
Yeah, Melatonin Research. The executive director or editor is Russel Reiter, who's a world expert on melatonin. And he co-authored the paper, which is a review with Scott Zimmerman, who is a light engineer. And Scott Zimmerman went out and basically used this paper and showed pretty convincingly that the human body is, however you want to say it, evolved, designed to really capture light, specifically infrared light, and use it in a way that is beneficial for the human body, as specifically at the mitochondrial level, which is a small organelle within almost every single cell in our body.
And the level of penetration of infrared is like, did you say 8 centimeters?
Well, based on what that article showed, it showed very clearly that the light may not penetrate down in a straight line, but in fact, once it gets inside and it's low energy enough, it'll actually bounce around a number of times before it finally settles. And this is not just like a one-off type of thing. There's an astrophysicist that works at the European Space Agency, a gentleman by the name of Bob Fosbury, who has a presence online as well, as given some lectures on this. He recently sent me a photograph of his hand in front of a infrared light source. And what's amazing to me about that light source, it says a lot, a picture is worth 1,000 words, is that the light, you don't even see the bones. It's penetrating through everything, it's diffusing through everything. And so there's really no question that infrared light not only penetrates clothes, but also skin and gets down deep into the tissue. In fact, people who remember this from the 1990s may remember kind of a humorous episode where Sony came out with a night vision camcorder, and it used infrared to do that.
Penetrate the clothes. Yeah,
and a couple of entrepreneurial and endearing, probably teenage boys or engineers figured out how to rig it so that you could actually see through clothes basically during the day. So Sony promptly withdrew the camera, and it's been gone ever since. But yeah.
So I have a little bit of background on this that dates back, since the dawn of digital photography. So basically what happened was film, flash companies like Vivitar, they were coming up with flash that went beyond the visible spectrum to the near infrared. They didn't mean to, they just didn't filter their light well.
Yeah.
And what was happening is it was penetrating the skin of fair-skinned people who don't have a lot of melanin in their skin. It didn't happen on blacks or Hispanics, or you have nice skin and everything. But for me, these flashes would make your face red. And the question was, why did they make your face red? And I remember working on that and talking to Vivitar and so on, and they had to change the spectrum of their flashes because in fair-skinned people, the infrared would penetrate the skin, reflect off the blood cells, and then you'd get this red face.
Yes.
And you look at somebody in natural light, like the tungsten light or whatever, although they produce some near infrared too.
They do.
But with those flashes, the flashes would really make you. So the flash companies had to change their flashes.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Scott Zimmerman found as well. He, in his article titled "Optics of the Human Body," published in 2019, he showed two different graphs: one with melanin-rich skin and one with melanin deficient.
Oh, interesting.
And it showed that the melanin-deficient skin had a slightly deeper penetration. Yeah, that's exactly what he found.
I'm an earth scientist by background, but when I was in grad school in the 70s, it was one of the things we were doing was placing digital cameras on satellites. And we were determining what land was forest and what wasn't.
I've seen those photographs.
Yeah. And it was revolutionary in the day. It was really great. And we would put these cameras, we couldn't believe it. We had 1 million pixels, megapixel camera. It was just amazing. We were taking photographs of all the spectrum, the various UV spectrums, all the infrared spectrums.
Yes.
There's 7-band cameras. Okay. So 3 visible and then, 2 in the UV and 3 in the infrared.
Yes.
And you could tell which was forest and what wasn't. You could saw open core samples from an oil field and tell, what had oil in it and what didn't. It was just fantastic.
Well, and part of that is the next interesting thing that Scott Zimmerman went into, which is the fact that vegetation, which is probably what you were looking at there on the satellite, is highly reflective of infrared light.
Yeah.
So like outside where we are here, under a tree, you have the benefit under a canopy of a tree of all of these leaves reflecting off all of this infrared light, so that the area underneath the tree is devoid of infrared light. And what do you know? That's the coolest place in the garden.
Yeah.
So how do we interact with infrared light? The way that we feel infrared light is that light is penetrating through our shirt onto our back, so that you could go outside, close your eyes, blindfold, someone spin you around, and you'd still be able to tell where the sun is. Why? Because you can feel it. And the only way you can feel it is because it's penetrating through and you're actually getting that sense. Infrared light from the leaves is also highly, highly reflective. And so you could actually get plenty of infrared light, which, as the article goes into, is very important for melatonin production. So melatonin is a powerful antioxidant. It has health benefits inside the cells right where they're needed. You could go out on a sunny day, be in the shade, be covered up with clothes, and be surrounded with leaves and trees and get plenty of infrared light and not have to worry about the direct sunlight, which carries a lot of ultraviolet radiation and can cause the basal cell and squamous cell carcinoma.
Yeah, that's the big takeaway for me is UV is one thing. That does the skin damage.
Right.
And infrared is a different thing. And they get lumped together, and that's a huge mistake.
Right. And to give another example, the biggest rage, I know this because my wife looks into this as well.
She's a physician too.
She's also a physician. Yeah. So
and she was as good a student as you, or maybe even
better.
Better, yeah. I've heard you say that.
Yeah, much better. What she has looked at and what we've seen is these masks that you can wear on your face. And what it does is this infrared light will penetrate down into the areas that produce the collagen. And the more collagen that's produced, the tighter the skin becomes, the less wrinkly it becomes. And so this is all the rage right now. And just because it's a rage, it doesn't mean there isn't science behind it.
Red light therapy.
Exactly.
Yeah, you've got several episodes on red light therapy.
Yeah.
And at first I thought, who is this quack?
Yes.
And I know something about light, but then I ended up buying. I haven't tried it yet, unfortunately, but they're expensive. But I bought
they're not cheap.
Yeah, I bought a red light wand.
Yes.
But Julia Roberts, Pretty Woman, says she endorses these red light masks.
So here's the thing about all of these lights and things, and the first impression that a lot of people get is that this is a money-making scam.
Yeah.
Right? It's just the light, and you're spending a lot of money. And in a sense, I tend to agree with it, and in only this way. You can get exactly the same thing from the sun.
Yeah.
So the problem is though the sun is also this source of ultraviolet. So how do you parse that out?
Mornings and evenings.
Exactly. So because you've got this atmosphere, when the sun is low down, the ultraviolet is going to have a much harder time of penetrating through. If you get out in the morning, if you get out right before sunset, not only is it beneficial from a circadian rhythm standpoint, getting those reds in the evening and getting the bright, real bright lux in the morning, from a circadian standpoint, it's also beneficial from a skin standpoint.
I noticed in my weather app, it has a UV index, and it always, like after 6 p.m., even in the summertime on hot days like today, it will say UV index 2 at 6 p.m. and low for the rest of the day.
Yes.
And so I always put a little sunscreen on my nose and then
Yeah.
think, well, I'll probably be okay for the rest of my skin.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that impact ultraviolet radiation here on planet Earth. One of them, of course, is the angle of the sun. But the other one that's actually pretty important, especially if you're watching this in Australia, is the ozone.
Yeah.
And so
they have
having
twice
a real
the
problem.
skin cancer
Yes.
rate that we have here, right?
And it's because they have less ozone. So ozone is O3, not
Yeah.
O2.
Yeah.
And O3 absorbs very well ultraviolet light and prevents
Oh, wow.
prevents that
interesting.
from getting down.
Talk about being near the equator versus northern latitudes for multiple sclerosis. Does it have something to do with multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, so all of those things. So latitude is basically a surrogate for the amount of hours of sunlight that someone would get on average. Obviously, you have to be outside to get it, but all those things sort of average out. And what really solidified it for me, and I had a sense that this was the case, but what solidified it for me was a study that was done in the winter of 2020, looking at the United States, looking at Italy and the UK. And these scientists looked at correlated death rates with latitude. A study that was done even before that looked at the surge of COVID-19 in Europe. When did the numbers start to surge up? And they looked at all of the different countries of Europe, and they looked at what were the temperatures in those countries over the autumn of 2020, what was the humidity during that time, and then finally, what was the latitude. Because a lot of people will say, it's not the reason why these things spike in the wintertime is because the temperature goes down. The reason why these things spike up in the wintertime is because the humidity is different. And we know that viruses and temperature and humidity. So this is what the study looked at. And in fact, the R value, R2, which is the way we correlate it, was absolutely zero for temperature.
Wow.
It was absolutely zero for humidity.
Correlation.
No correlation whatsoever. But where there was a 0.8 correlation, very statistically significant, was latitude.
Wow.
The surges in Europe in autumn of 2020 basically started with Finland and ended with Greece.
Wow.
And it was literally marching down the globe of Europe. So armed with that information, what researchers at the University of Edinburgh did was they looked at the United States in the wintertime, but they completely eliminated the southern part of the country that could get enough vitamin D, even in the wintertime. So they wanted to look at light that could not make any vitamin D. So that was that part of the United States. And they found that as you went up in latitude in any given area, the mortality rate for COVID-19 went up. And it was completely independent, therefore, of vitamin D. So then they took those results and they replicated those in the UK, and they also replicated those in Italy. And they found that specifically that latitude correlated with mortality completely independent of vitamin D. It was at that point that I knew that we were dealing with something else.
Wow.
So then this study that you're referring to in terms of multiple sclerosis and controls simply it was a correlation study. They looked at people who had the least sun exposure and the most sun exposure. They divided them into quartiles. And when they mapped those out, those with the most sun exposure had the most whole brain volume and gray matter. So the question is why would this be? And how did this work? So we already talked about how near-infrared radiation can penetrate through soft tissue. It can penetrate even through bone. What Scott Zimmerman proposed, and he's a light engineer, was that if you think about the skull of the human brain, over the human brain, the light should penetrate through the scalp, should penetrate through the skull. Once it hits the cerebral spinal fluid, this is based on light physics and Snell's law, what this tends to do is diffuse the light all throughout evenly. So in other words, even though the sun might be hitting on this side, because of internal diffusion, it's going to spread all the way through.
Diffraction.
Right. And then if you look at the sulci and the gyri, which is those bends and curves on the surface of the brain, that will tend to collect the light and diffuse it down into the deepest crevices of the brain.
Yeah.
Then if you look and see where the white matter and the gray matter is, the gray matter is situated only on the surface, all the way around. The gray matter is basically the portion of the brain that contains the cell bodies. And that's where the mitochondria is. Whereas the white matter is all axons and myelin sheaths where there's no mitochondria. So what you have essentially is a brain which uses the same technology, by the way, that our aviation industry uses to evade radar, absorbing radars and not allowing it to bounce off. So basically, it's a collector of infrared radiation, and it nourishes the neurons where they're the most highly energetic.
Why are we not talking about this?
I don't know.
You're the only person talking about this, as far as I can tell, at least reaching consumers. Oh, what I was going to say is you just gave that talk, and the audience was mesmerized and said they'd never heard this before.
Yeah.
I mean, I talked to person after person in there who said, I've never heard anybody talk about this.
Yeah. Well, when I started talking about it, I immediately started to find out who else was talking about it. And so there have been people talking about this well before I have. In fact,
but they didn't have 1.6 million subscribers.
Maybe that's what it was, or perhaps it was just the science maybe hasn't caught up to it, and now it is, and so now it's more acceptable, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I will say this: so that we until recently have not had the science to really explain what was going on, and we still don't have all of the science. Like, we know that ultraviolet radiation can cause damage, but we know that infrared light can improve the functioning of the mitochondria, but we're still not sure exactly why it does it or how it does it. But nevertheless, we have known for a very, very long time, and this can get back into bigger ideas in philosophy, going back 100 years. Okay, so if we look at the hospital systems and we look at the sanitariums of yesteryear and how people were taken care of, for instance, in the pandemic of 1918, it was well known at that time that getting people outside in sunlight, at least in some sectors of the healthcare industry, which was not as mechanistic as it is today, it was well known. And
is that because they thought clear air, or they thought sunshine, or both?
I think both. I mean, there's a really interesting quote from Florence Nightingale, and you know, you may say what you want about these people in the 1800s. They didn't have the technology that we had.
Well, let me tell you what I want to say about them.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've noticed on my channel, I have all these historical books.
Yes. Okay.
And they go back to the 1400s, 1600s. I've got texts from the Roman times and so on.
Yeah.
And I love reading these old books, because they knew things we don't know today. For example, some of the books are dedicated to, is tame meat healthier is wild meat healthier than tame meat? And they compared them, and they just came up with, there's no way these penned-in pigs, and stall-fed beef and everything is sedentary animals are nearly as healthy as wild animals.
Interesting.
And they were eating a wide variety of animals. They have a whole list of partridges and pheasants and everything else they were eating, squirrels and rabbits and you name it. They were eating a wide variety, just like we think of wide variety of foods today. They were thinking that back then too, but they frowned on tame animals. Well, now, we think about wild fish because they're still available, but wild animals aren't available to us. So we're kind of like a boiled frog. And so we're eating all these, these sedentary animals that have been bred to have higher fat, intramuscular fat and everything else. So,
and not to mention all of the epidemiological issues with keeping a bunch of animals together.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Pandemics and
absolutely
pathogens and everything else. The other thing is, to me, all of the longevity diets that have ever been developed were developed in previous centuries. The Mediterranean diet, the Asian diet, the vegetarian diet that you mostly live. Yeah. And in fact, for people watching, we think of these blue zones as very exotic, Costa Rica and the island of Crete or whatever, and we are looking at a blue zone person right now, and from downtown LA, and the longest lived blue zone in the world now, right? Because the other ones, the grocery store is invaded, and they're all eating Snicker bars now and Doritos.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're the last remaining blue zone that actually lives, your traditional diet.
We try to. So I moved to Loma Linda when I was 9 or 10 years old. And that was back in 1983. And I'll tell you, I was eating meat when I moved there. So it's an interesting thing. Obviously, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in terms of its university there and its medical mission, is sort of there. The reason why I moved there was because my dad wanted to go to dental school. And so we didn't move there with the desire to be healthy. I don't even think blue zones existed at that time. It was just for the fact that he had to go to dental school. But as I grew up in that environment and lived with the people that were there and went to church with the people that were there, it's kind of rubs off on you. And you start to see that people, don't eat meat and why. But it wasn't until I actually went to medical school there. So I even went through college at the local university, University of California, Riverside. And it wasn't until I got to Loma Linda School of Medicine that I started to read the studies, and it was becoming more apparent to me, and I had the ability to interpret it myself and read the studies, that I started to slowly and surely cut out the most egregious things that I thought in my diet. So red meat first, and then chicken and poultry, and then cutting down on the amount of fish. I might occasionally once or twice have a fish even today, but yeah, so cutting those things out from that standpoint. And it's interesting because many people think that Adventist, it's a strict regulation of the religion in terms of diet. It actually is one of the least strict aspects of it. And it's actually one of the things that makes the Adventist health study so powerful. And that is that if you were to get a bunch of Adventists together in Southern California, and what you would find that would be most universal among all of them is they would not drink alcohol, they would not smoke, they would go to church on once a week on the Sabbath and rest. Those would be probably the most universal things. The things then that would start being more of a variable, but still very universal, is the fact that they would follow the dietary regulations of Exodus and Leviticus. So so in other words, if they were eating meat, they would eat meat of an animal that would chew the cud and have a split hoof. So beef would be acceptable, but not pork. A fish with scales and fins would be acceptable, but not like shellfish. That would be almost universal. Then it would start to vary very quickly from there. So who eats chicken, who eats beef, who only eats, in other words, omnivore versus pesco-vegetarian versus lacto-ovo-vegetarian versus vegan. And I think that's the beauty of the Adventist health study, is that it tends to phase out or very strictly narrow the healthy user effect. So if you want to study diet, you're studying diet in a population of people who for the most part do everything healthy except change their diet in a certain point.
Yeah, interesting.
And the interesting thing about that is that the most popular group in the Adventist health study was omnivore.
Yeah.
And then next after that was pesco-vegetarian, then lacto-ovo, and then vegan.
Yeah. It's interesting that, that bar chart is they showed a bar chart for everything, for diabetes,
BMI,
for all different 5 subsets of,
Yeah.
pesco-vegetarian, vegan, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and so on. But the vegans just owned those charts. And Gary Fraser, who led the study, said, well, there's a lot of healthy user bias there because they ate more fruits and vegetables and everything else.
He would know the study better than me, yes.
Yeah. He said, you just have to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
But when asked about who lived the longest, it was the pesco-vegetarians who lived the longest. How could that be when the charts favored the vegans so much, but the pesco-vegetarians, do we have any kind of hypothesis?
We don't, other than...
they were close, right?
Yeah, I would have to look back and see whether or not that BMI was the same timing as the mortality. And if it was, then it would be hard to explain that. But it would still be good evidence to cut out red meats.
Yeah.
Which is actually one of the videos that we did on Medcram, talking about something that I don't see a lot of people talking about, and it's this whole thing about new 5GC and new 5AC and things of that nature, which is unique to red meat.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's 2 glycoproteins, or actually sialic acids. What is a sialic acid? A sialic acid is a 9-carbon sugar, which if your hand is like the thing on the edge of the cell, it would be your fingertips. Then you have glycoproteins and proteins. These are things that we typically don't think about on proteins, but if you can imagine a protein floating in your body on a cell, that would be like a Christmas tree. And these sialic acids would be like the decorations on the Christmas tree. And in fact, it would be the first thing that an immune cell would encounter if it's trying to tell whether or not a cell is real or not, is self or non-self.
Yeah, I see.
So the interesting thing is there's 2 types of sialic acids basically in terms of mammals, and that is nu5AC and nu5GC. So humans seem to have lost the ability to make nu5GC. So when we were born from birth, all of our cells are coated with just the sialic acid of nu5AC. But that's not the case with the majority of the rest of the mammals world, so red meat, pigs, cows, you name it. They are able to produce both nu5AC and nu5GC. Now, these are very similar structures to each other. They only differ by like an oxygen atom. And so when a human being who has antibodies against Nu5-GC because it's not self. When you eat a mammal that has meat obviously coated with Nu5-AC and GC, what happens, unfortunately, is when it goes through the digestive system, it gets digested enough to be able to be absorbed, but not completely destroyed. And so the cell machinery that puts these sialic acids onto the cell can't tell the difference between Nu5-AC and Nu5-GC. So it will essentially incorporate the animal's Nu5-GC sialic acid into your cells covering.
Wow.
And so now you're coating yourself, every time you eat red meat, you're coating your cells with a foreign substance, and your immune system is going to recognize that. And essentially what you get is an inflammatory situation, which can lead to cancer and inflammation. It's one of the reasons why we believe that red meat particularly is so inflammatory in our endothelial cells and can lead to cardiovascular events.
Wow. Do you ever see alpha-gal syndrome in LA?
No, have not.
I think it's a southern US kind of thing. So should we blow up the comment section now?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Tell us about COVID and vaccines.
Yeah, so from the very beginning, realized that I felt there was a moment in my life when I knew that COVID was coming. It was hitting New York, and I knew it was only a matter of time. And I needed to do everything I possibly could to protect my patients. And so I adopted what's known as the Swiss cheese model. Swiss cheese model is basically the same thing that the airline industry uses, which is to put in enough things in the system that have holes in different parts of the cheese so that nothing can get through to the other side. If you have enough slices with holes, there are holes in everything, but holes in different places, then you can be protected 100%. Not any particular piece of cheese is going to protect you 100%. So I saw vaccines as just one of those slices of cheese. The other slices of cheese, of course, is doing all the things that we just talked about: nutrition, exercise, all that sort of stuff. Metabolic health, early detection, making sure that one of the things that we haven't talked about is something that I really believe helps, and the data has shown this, is that interferon. So enhancing your body's ability to make interferon is extremely important early on in COVID to turn a severe infection into a mild infection. Well, what it turns out is one of the easiest, safest, and most effective ways of increasing your body's interferon in a illness is to increase the body temperature. And one of the ways of doing that, and it's been actually tried for over 100 years, is hydrotherapy. So basically heating the body up, making them perspire. That increases body temperature and increases interferon. So obviously not treating with Tylenol unless the fever is so high that it's going to cause a cardiovascular issue. And allowing the human body to do what it needs to do.
I see. So all the talk on the internet, as you probably know, is harm from vaccines. I've been vaccine harmed.
Yes.
It's real, not real, or?
It's certainly possible. Absolutely. I mean, I have never, as a critical care physician, as a pulmonologist, I have never come across any intervention, medical or non, that doesn't have risk. But realizing, though, that just because something has risk doesn't mean that we never use it. Like, for instance, I can give an example of an anticoagulant. We use anticoagulants all the time in people who have the tendency to have blood clots. Now, what we try to do is figure out if there's a higher risk of bleeding or a higher risk of blood clot. And so there are certain people that we would try those in and do it. Something that's completely counterintuitive to me is to mandate someone gets an anticoagulant for a particular diagnosis. It should be on a case-by-case basis, and you're like, if somebody comes in with exactly the same disease as the person I just gave an anticoagulant, but this person has fallen 5 times in the last 24 hours, I'm not going to give them an anticoagulant. And it's because I've taken the time to talk to that person to see exactly what's going on, and I'm trying to tailor the treatment for the medication.
Yeah, so I went through this because I had a stroke that gave me aphasia for the morning. I had trouble forming my sentences when I woke up.
Yeah.
And she recognized it as a stroke right away, and I had to go to the emergency room again. And once I was up in the ICU, they said, "How does this guy have a stroke? Of all people, he's
healthy.
Yeah, got all the good metrics. How in the world does he have a stroke?" And it turns out I have an open PFO for one thing.
Nah.
And I've had various different heart things, rheumatic fever as a child and so on.
Yes.
So then it became, do we close that PFO with a titanium plate?
Yes.
The cardiologist favored that, but the neurologist favored, no, you better keep him on Eliquis for life, because this is a cryptographic stroke. We're not sure what happened here, and we can't take any more risks. He better be. And the cardiologists were saying, yeah, but he goes mountain biking and everything else.
This is exactly the discussion.
He's going to knock his head,
Absolutely.
and then he's going to bleed out, or whatever happens, So, they couldn't agree on what to do, and they left it up to me, and which was fine. It was, I was trying to be as informed as I could, and take their advice. I have deep respect for both their points of view, but they were saying, well, he's 70. We don't do these closing up PFO operations for anybody over 60, but for him, we would do it because he's in shape.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, can you watch yourself when you mountain bike, but you still have a car accident,
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about it, is that there's certain risks that's just unmanageable, right? You can have a perfect diet, do everything right, and get into a car accident.
So do we know anything about the injury rate from COVID vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, we know about these things because we are able to look with high resolution. So this is the issue. The issue is that the side effects from the COVID vaccines are, the incidence is small enough that it's not going to be readily apparent on a phase 3 trial. So if you remember the phase 3 trials that actually got EUA for the Pfizer and the Moderna, they were about 20, 30,000. And that was enough to be able to tell the difference between those that had symptoms and those that didn't have symptoms. It certainly wasn't enough to determine whether or not it could save a life, because you would need to have many, many more, and that would take such a long time. And of course, time is lives, right, when you're in a pandemic. So what they started to do was post EUA screening and adding up the numbers. So there was a study that was done, it was published in Circulation based on the UK population. I want to say they had like 48 million people in that study. When you have 48 million pixels on a camera, you can tell things in excruciating detail. And that's the type of resolution that you need to be able to say, in this group, we see a difference between these two groups, and we are confident that it's a real difference because we're able to see 42 million people. So in that study, it showed that there was no question that myocarditis had increased in patients with who got the COVID-19 vaccine. But also in that study, it showed that people who had COVID had even higher rates of myocarditis. Yeah, the difference is though you can't predict who's going to get COVID, but it's certainly you know who's going to get the injection because you're giving it to them. So again, it's this, and they saw that the myocarditis cases were higher in the young. And so if you're trying to mitigate and you're trying to reduce risk but increase benefit, then there's a point to be made to say, well, maybe we should give these type of mRNA vaccines in older people and maybe something else in the younger, or not at all. These are all reasonable discussions.
Wow.
Yeah.
What doesn't make sense to me is the way we're raising chickens and other birds and things to create new pandemics.
Yeah.
You've got some videos on H5N1?
Yes, yeah. So I think at the start out here, we have to almost rethink our relationship with animals and what we're doing, because we are creating a perfect storm, in my opinion, where we are putting chickens or whatever livestock we're talking about into very close settings where it's very easy to transmit. And we are, it's almost like we're bringing in the poultry workers in there to get whatever comes out of this mess of a petri dish to see whether or not it's going to stick. And
it's going to stick.
Yeah, and so I know right now, for instance, in Europe and certain countries in Europe, they are now vaccinating poultry workers, the high-risk workers who work in these areas. So it's obviously well known that these are the areas where this is coming out of, and hoping that if we can vaccinate them, that any virus that gets into them is not going to be able to replicate and get out into the pandemic. But it doesn't really get rid of the source of where this is all coming from. It's large population. Chickens in a normal wild environment would never congregate in that kind of a concentration. I don't think it was ever designed. Nature was never intended for that to happen. And yet that's exactly what we're doing.
Plus these are Franken chickens.
Franken chickens, yes.
I mean, they can barely walk. I mean,
yes.
Not health. I don't know what happens to cattle. So Ansel Keys wrote in Time magazine in 1961. I digitized that article. I got the original article and digitized it, put it online.
Yeah.
he said some astounding things in there. He was on the cover of it. And one of the things he said he was worried about was the marbling of beef, because it was increasing the fat content of the beef in unnatural ways. Fat was being stored intramuscular, sort of like when you get diabetes or whatever.
Yeah.
And so the fat content of beef was going up and up. Well, I looked at the nutrition information for McDonald's patties, and right now they're at 64% fat.
Wow.
By calories, not by weight, but fat has more calories. So 64%, it's like 36% protein or something like that. I mean, wild animals are 15%. You know, it's just like nothing we've ever eaten before. And those poor cows, you know, I don't know, you know, what their health is like. You know, they don't get any of the things that you're advising humans to do.
Right.
They're not even getting light. They're in pens, you know.
Correct.
And you wouldn't think they would have very good immune systems. They're sedentary.
No.
They're closed in with each other. They're not getting light. They're not getting a very nutritious diet. Any of those things.
Yeah, and to add to that, the fact that they're not having a good immune system means that they're susceptible to infections.
Exactly.
And of course, the solution for that is to use antibiotics, which is where the majority of the antibiotics are used in this country, is in animal husbandry. And of course, we consume that meat with the antibiotics in it, and that can cause antibiotic resistance in human beings.
I didn't know that. So you're saying that if the meat contains antibiotics, we absorb some of that, and
absolutely.
Does that hurt our microbiome?
Absolutely.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So I'd like to describe, you know, kind of like what earlier today in the lecture, Dr. Columbus said, Batiste, and about how there's a war going on in your gut. There's good bacteria and bad bacteria, and whatever you do, you're either feeding one side or the other.
Yeah.
And it's the one area other than photobiomodulation that is expanding dramatically.
Microbiome.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know the Sonnenbergs pretty well at Stanford, and they've got a great microbiome lab going there.
Yeah.
And I heard Erica I was just there a month ago, and Erica said, you know, we didn't really know what we were looking at when we started the microbiome lab 15 years ago. We didn't know what a good microbiome was. We didn't know what caused it to flourish. We didn't know any of those things. And it's come down to two simple things: fiber and fermented foods, and a diversity of foods. The biggest diversity you can get, plant foods.
Yeah.
And they weren't even really, you know, they didn't have a dietary philosophy or anything like that when they started. So.
And it's amazing what I see on social media about how you don't need fiber.
Oh, I know.
Fiber is not necessary. Fiber causes constipation.
Yeah, I know. I sort of have this sense that, you know, we wreck our microbiome so we can't digest fiber anymore. So then we eat fiber-free foods and we feel better, like just red meat.
Yes.
And it reminds me of when I was a kid. I grew up we didn't have dental care, and my mom was impoverished. And so I didn't ever brush my teeth. And when I finally did see a dentist, he said, you better brush your teeth. You know, they're red and puffy. So I tried to brush them and they'd bleed. So I stopped, you know. Dentist doesn't know what he's talking about. And so then when I went back to the dentist, I said, I'm not brushing they bleed. And he said, we got a paradox here. You don't brush your teeth, so they bleed when you try. And so you stopped brushing your teeth. You got to brush your teeth and they'll stop bleeding.
Eventually,
yeah. And so fiber in the gut reminds me of that. I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, but if you wreck your microbiome, and, you know,
I'm just curious. You told me before that you had rheumatic heart disease and then the bleeding from the teeth. I'm just putting those two together. Do
they go together?
You get a little bit of a bacteremia when you have periodontitis and you
I didn't
brush.
know that.
Yeah, you could actually cause bacteria to go in.
Talking about the infrared light.
Yeah.
So it sounds like instead of putting one of those masks on, that if I'm understanding it correctly, if we went outside the right time of day, early in the morning or at night, and we're under a tree, that we would get some infrared without worrying about the UV.
That is true. You don't even have to be under a tree. If you're even outside, that's perfectly fine. Even if you're out in the sun, that's perfectly fine as well. The devices that you can buy specifically for skin enhancement have been tested, have been looked at, and the wavelengths that you're getting for the skin is probably correct in terms of stimulating collagen. Now, if you want the other benefits of infrared light that penetrate through, go into your skull, do that, we don't really know which wavelength is the best wavelength. And so from my standpoint, one of the advantages with getting outside in the sun is you're getting all of the wavelengths.
Of them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so it's less of a guessing game. And I just, philosophically, I tend to think that nature probably packages things better than we can. And so if the sun is giving us, full biological spectrum, then there's probably a benefit to that. The other thing that's interesting that I'll mention as well, ultraviolet light, we kind of make it kind of the bogeyman, but it is the source of vitamin D. And it also may be beneficial in terms of disinfecting our skin of certain types of things because it's so powerful. So one thing that's interesting is let's pretend that you were going to stay outside the whole day, okay? As the sun is starting to come up, very high infrared predominance, very low ultraviolet predominance. So what's going on there is that your skin is building up in terms of melatonin, it's building up antioxidants, it's getting ready for the day, getting ready for the onslaught of the rest of the day. As the sun starts to go up, now you're having more equal ultraviolet and infrared, but that's okay because your skin has been allowed to build up that protection to get you through that period of time. Now, as the sun is going down, any damage that might have occurred from ultraviolet radiation can now be repaired. And again, you're getting a lot of infrared light. Sun finally sets, and you've gone through the day with the right protection. So it's kind of built into the system of how the sun goes up, how the sun comes down, how there's more atmosphere at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And then, let's pretend that we were back, home on the range, no electricity, have a nice campfire, and it's red, you're getting infrared heat from that perhaps, or infrared light from that, and the stars above you are very dim, and it's low light, and it's dark. You're going into your tent, you're going into your bed, and it's dark, and you get all the benefits of nighttime melatonin, slow wave sleep, all of those benefits.
And how about a cloudy day? Do we just say it's almost the same?
No, unfortunately, cloudy days are a problem. And part of the reason is actually the efficacy of infrared light. We believe that infrared light, at least one of the theories, is that infrared light is just the right wavelength to vibrate water and to arrange it into a way that makes it less viscous. Now, I don't know for a fact that this is how it works. We know it works. We just don't know how it works. And it's believed that the pump in the mitochondria that makes the ATP might run more smoothly when the water around it is in an ordered fashion. And so what does this mean? What does all this mean? It means that water molecules are very effective at absorbing certain wavelengths of infrared light. And so as a result of that, if you were to look at the ground spectrum of the sun on a cloudy day, you would see that there are certain areas in the infrared spectrum that are reduced.
Okay.
And therefore, you might not be getting as much infrared from the sun if it's trying to penetrate through the clouds. And you'll notice this. Let's say you go outside and it's partially cloudy and the clouds are moving, and you close your eyes. When the sun comes out, do you feel warmth?
Oh, yeah.
And then when the sun goes behind the cloud, does it go away? That's infrared light. So it's very, I'll just add one other thing, and that is that study that was in Brazil that looked at LED in COVID patients to see if they had improvement, and it showed that they got out of the hospital 4 days earlier. The wavelength that they used in that study was 940 nanometers, and it's right around there that we see the maximal absorption in water. So there may be something to 940.
Aha. But I think I remember somewhere that UV can still get through the cloud.
Yes, that's possible because the water molecules are not going to absorb, but ultraviolet has a hard time getting through the atmosphere in general.
Okay.
Again, ultraviolet light is blocked by ozone, and of course that's the major thing that does it. That's why Australia and those areas around the hole in the ozone are going to get more ultraviolet. But clothes are very effective at blocking ultraviolet. Obviously, they manufacture sunscreens and sunblocks that do that. There's some debate about what are the risks of wearing sunblock and how much gets absorbed, and I think that's a debate worth having. But realize that ultraviolet can be blocked fairly easily.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then I had a similar question. I've got the prescription glasses that change when sun hits them.
Oh.
Is that blocking UV really? And if so, is it also blocking infrared? Do you know?
It depends on the glasses, but it's fairly safe to say that any kind of glasses are going to be blocking most types of ultraviolet, although you might have to check that and actually make sure. That's important because ultraviolet light can cause cataracts. So you have to be...
So these glasses act as sunglasses when I go outside.
Yes.
They change.
Okay.
And the reason I bought them that way is because I thought they blocked UV.
Yeah, so the blocking aspect of your glasses for UV has nothing to do with the shades. That's blocking visible light. And ultraviolet is out of that spectrum and may be blocked by the actual material itself. I would have to see the research on the operator curve on the glasses to see how much ultraviolet to know for sure. What I would say is that if you are wanting to go outside in the morning time to get the benefit of bright light on your eyes, not only on your circadian rhythm, but also on the perihabenular nucleus, you're going to want to remove all of those things. Because the more light you get in, the less time is required to spend outside to get the required amount of light.
So will blue light blocking glasses help with Kindle and other lights like TV?
It will help. So again, we're talking about the effect at night of light and its effect on the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in your retina that project back to the suprachiasmatic nucleus and then from there project back to the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin normally unless there is stimulation and then it shuts it down. So what is it that stimulates the retinal ganglion cells? It's wavelengths in the blue range. So I would say if I had to rank it in order, the absolute best thing to do is to have no light.
That's very difficult.
Difficult, yes. The next best thing is to have no blue light. Okay? And then, finally, as we go down the list, obviously, blocking other types of light is not going to be as good. But if you had to block some light, blue light would be the best. This is the reason why you may notice when you're working on your computers at night, they may switch to night mode.
Night mode.
And it looks a little bit more reddish, a little bit more warmer colors. And that's because they're trying to reduce the amount of that 480 light that's getting into your eyes. Does it actually beneficially help? There was a study that was recently published that showed it really doesn't help. So that's why I would say the best thing to do is not to have any lights at all.
Okay, and similar to that, I think you mentioned something about TV. Some TVs are designed to be better.
Any of those. So television sets, iPhones, all of those things may have a night mode, which makes them a little bit more warmer in color. Again, I think it probably is treating a placebo. Based on the studies, it would be better to just hit the other night mode, which is the power button.
So Toni is about to start a fascinating conversation with Roger about sleep. So I'm going to break this episode into two. I'll publish the second part next week. And by the way, Roger did give a phenomenal TEDx talk that I've seen a draft of, and I think they're going to publish it pretty soon. So I opened this episode in Peru, so it seems appropriate to close it from Peru.
Over there you can see that said, Viva el Peru.
Viva el Peru. I like that word, viva.
Viva, that means claps.
Claps?
So, yeah,
Great.
claps.
Wow.